Okay, so this video is slightly different than my usual videos. It's kind of short, but it's based on an idea of a tweet I recently made about trend lines. I keep seeing people posting trend lines, posting like, oh, look, this is going to be a breakout chart because look at this trend line. I think one of the examples was Casper. Let's see, Casper on KuCoin. Yeah, so it was Casper with a trend line drawn like this, right? The pink line being the trend line. Um, and that was kind of drawn out. And I gave them the example when they asked of like, what do you think of this? I gave them the example of often these trend lines are in fact liquidity trend lines. So they're not actual, like they look so weak. There's only one tap, two tap maybe if you want to count this. But rookie traders or traders that just overuse trend lines and depend on them solely for their trading strategy are gonna pick this as a trend line and say, this is definitely a trend line, guys, and I'm gonna trade this because here's a good position along. Now it might be a good position along, who knows, right? But this often is a liquidity trend line. It's not a strong one. It's not a particularly obvious one, and there's no particular reason to really be trading this, right? It's not in a great position in the chart in general. So what's clear is that we're in some type of range, etc., right? But they will look at this trend line anyways. So what tends to happen on trend lines is a liquidity grab, right? So you have to imagine kind of it looking like this. So people who are looking at this trend line will think once price does this, it's over, right? And then what you'll see is a rebound and higher, right? Because price doesn't actually move by the rules of people who use trend lines. It moves by liquidity. So you have to understand where liquidity rests, and there's a bunch of liquidity resting under these type of trend lines because there's so many rookie traders, amateur traders that are always depending on their trend lines to be the indicator of entering or exiting a trade. So they put their stop loss right on this trend line thinking, yeah, this is definitely like the spot to be. So all it does is going to break down the trend line, break down these levels, retest something like midair, right? Or retest some type of order block, maybe down here, right? And then come into this and then rip again, recovering that trend line, looking like, oh, that was just a deviation. And that is, in fact, called deviation in some people's strategies, right? So that's kind of what I wanted to cover, and I have a few more examples here. We can just Control Z my way back to the Bitcoin chart. Let's see, there we go. And I have a few more examples of roughly the same thing here, right? So here's bulls, right? During this phase of Bitcoin back in May 2022. Looking at this trend line, thinking, hey, we're holding up at support, right? So this could be considered some type of support historically, right here, right? So this order block kind of, or we'll just draw out a line like this, right? We're holding at support, we're forming this descending triangle. This is definitely going to form a breakout, and then we're going to continue our bull run, right? So it's just a little pullback, it's fine. So what happens is this trend line gets breaking out of, everybody starts getting bullish, right? And it's like the big bull break is here. And this is where people start loading up even more again, just for this to be a continuation, right? And you can imagine it the same way if you're here, right? I would actually have seen it as more of a pennant bearish, but hey, the point is you would assume, hey, we're retesting this level and now we're breaking down from it. This is probably just a retest, and now we're at least going to come back down to here and maybe then go down, right? So essentially you would expect something like a breakout here, a retest here, and then maybe see what happens here before we do maybe collapse or whatever, right? But again, a trend line example of it's not always perfect, right? And often these trend lines just break, and you can see here's a perfect example of it just breaking. It's not even like a fake out, it's just a break, right? So you can see that this is just tries to hold on and it just breaks through. Now that's of course the point of a trend line, that like it's not solid and it can break through, of course, no problem, but nonetheless it's not the holy grail of investing because often it's just liquidity getting grabbed. Here's a similar thing. You can see a trend line, it's trending upwards, and then what happens is you can see here's a perfect example of what happens to volume 2 is you can see the trend line, you can see people are excited, right? So from right here to right here, right to right here, more or less, right? Yeah, right down the breakdown here. you can see that the volume levels are relatively high compared to this period right up until here, right? Why? Because at this point, people are thinking this trend line is holding up and we're having this bull pennant shape, or ascending triangle shape, kind of like breaking out here, right, with this trend line. And what's going to happen is this immediately. And the moment this trend line breaks, you can see that everybody's discouraged. It's like, oh, what's going to happen now is, you know, some type of new lows, right? After this crash, I think this, yeah, so after this crash, was this the COVID crash? I believe it was, wasn't it? Yeah, it was, right? So there's doubt in the markets and everybody's discouraged at this point when the trend line breaks. Meanwhile, any institutional investor or any big investor is thinking, hey, look, at this point, it's time to accumulate, while everybody else is like, holy shit, this is over, it's game over because the trend line broke. So again, don't put your full conviction in trend lines. And then I think the next example of this is a token I recently, well, not recently, quite a while back, stumbled upon. I've just been kind of keeping my eyes on. You can see here, you have this trend line and it's shaping up rather nice. Arguably, it's looking pretty good. You can draw maybe another one, but I would just keep it at this one. And it's shaping up rather nice for it to be some type of, you know, there's some resistance / support right here, the 0.04 level, more or less. And if this continues to trend as it has been now, we can definitely see this come up, retest this, and maybe ultimately set in new highs, right? And just go crazy based on that. But you can already see, now this might not be drawn perfectly because I just moved it, so let's just move this back down. You can already see this trend line is breaking down as we speak, right? So hey, what could happen is we just have a little wick down and it's just a small deviation. Nonetheless, this is going to be discouraging for a lot of traders because hey, this trend line is now broken. Now what could happen here is this, a little wick under this where the stop losses are resting, right? A little wick under there, recovery of trend line, and a rip. But this has stopped out. This little block right here would stop out so many traders you can't even begin to imagine, right? There's a little price action that's going to happen, or it could happen right here, or historically does happen a bunch on charts, right? This is going to be the menace for a lot of people because they have so much conviction in the trend lines must hold, and that's going to be the holy grail of this crazy breakout. And they put their stop losses under it, and they get stopped out. And the institutional investors don't give a fuck, and they have their positions literally being put on in longs as you are getting stopped out because of your strong conviction in trend lines. So, do I still use trend lines? Of course. But I use them with the nuance of saying, hey, look, this trend line is not the holy grail. I'm going to keep it here, even if this breaks down, and think, let's see if we can recover this trend line after seeing some form of deviation, which this would be, right? This entire area would now, this entire area would now turn into a deviation off the broader trend. The trend line is still actually intact, right? But this deviation just stopped out a bunch of silly traders who decided that they should put their stop loss right under here on the trend line or right under this low. Now, this low, I would say, is a decent place to put your stop loss nonetheless, to be fair. But anyways, I think you guys get it. It's a relatively long in the end lesson about trend lines and the nuance of using them, and you can use them to enter trades like this where these silly quote unquote trend line users get stopped out because they have such conviction in trend lines. So that's essentially the lesson. Like, keep an eye open of how you can interpret trend line support resistance differently than it just being a hard line, right? And I'll make the same thing on support and resistance of it is not a hard line, and in fact, if you view it as a hard line, you're the person that's going to get stopped out so much it's unbelievable, because the point of people believing that there's a hard line there that is support is turning them into liquidity or resistance or trend lines. You become the liquidity by believing these things, so you have to stop believing that that is a hard line that can't be passed, because this trade people are going to get discouraged right here, but the fact is this trade could still become a beautiful trade for a bunch of people if you just stay entered or re-enter at this position as a deviation. So yeah, so see how you use this and kind of add this to your trading game, and then good luck.